The first time I saw a man die in the air, it didn't sound like war. It sounded like someone dropping a hammer inside a metal drum. And by the time I turned toward the noise, the sky had already swallowed him whole. We all thought courage would be enough. None of us understood that the air itself could lie to you. December 1942, somewhere over the Solomon Islands. I was 19, a waist gunner on a B-17, hands wrapped around a Browning M2 that shuddered like it wanted to tear free. The air tasted like hot brass and burnt oil, the smell of cordite sticking in the back of my throat. Beneath my boots, the belly of the bomber trembled with each burst from the 50 seconds. The Pacific was an endless mirror below us, blue, empty, deceptive. The first zero appeared out of nowhere, just a shimmer of light at our 10 o'clock, then a dart cutting across the clouds. My heart jumped. I did what I'd been trained to do, put the crosshairs dead on its fuselage and squeeze. The gun thundered. Brass casings clattered across the floor, and 50 rounds screamed into the void. I watched every tracer streak behind the enemy's tail like a trail of fireflies chasing a ghost. Not one hit. "Missed! God damn it, you missed!" someone yelled over the intercom. But I could see the truth before they said it. The zero didn't even flinch. The pilot never jinked, never broke formation. He just glided through my fire as if my bullets had passed through a dream. That moment branded itself into my mind. I'd aimed exactly where I was supposed to, done everything the manuals told me to do, and it still hadn't mattered. By the time I reloaded, the zero was already behind us, sunlight flashing off its wings like a blade. I felt something I'd never felt before, not fear of dying, but the shame of being useless. Later, I'd learned that I wasn't alone. Every gunner from every theater, Europe, Africa, the Pacific, was seeing the same thing. Tracers curling harmlessly behind enemy planes. Our officers called it statistical variance. The rest of us called it madness. We were trained, disciplined, and armed with the best machine guns ever made, yet we couldn't hit a damn thing. When we landed back at Henderson Field, our crew chief stood beside the bullet-riddled fuselage, counting the holes where the armor hadn't held. "Eddie, what the hell happened up there?" he asked. I wanted to tell him I'd done everything right, that I'd followed every rule the Air Corps had drilled into us. But how do you explain that the sky itself had changed the rules? In early 1943, the Army Air Forces analyzed the nightmare. They took gun camera footage from hundreds of missions, studying frame by frame how our bullets moved through the air. The results were devastating. Trained gunners, men who had fired thousands of rounds in practice, were achieving hit rates below 4% against crossing targets. 4%. That meant 96 bullets out of every 100 disappeared into nothing. The math was merciless. A typical engagement lasted maybe 10 seconds. The Browning M2 spat 13 rounds a second, which meant I could put 130 rounds into the air before the enemy vanished. 4% of that was 5 hits. 5 hits might punch holes in aluminum, but they wouldn't bring down a zero. It was like trying to kill a shark with pebbles. Every time we went up, 10 men's lives depended on someone solving that math problem. In Europe, the 8th Air Force was losing 188 bombers a month, nearly 2,000 men killed, captured, or missing every 30 days. Every one of them had gunners who fired their hearts out into empty air. That night, I sat beside the plane's wing, feeling the heat still radiating off its skin, and stared at the bullet holes stitched across the metal like some cruel handwriting. We'd all done what felt right: aim straight, hold steady, pull the trigger, and physics had laughed in our faces. I remember whispering into the dark, "What if we're fighting the wrong enemy?" Because it didn't feel like we were battling pilots anymore. It felt like we were fighting time itself, the quarter of a second between the bullet leaving the barrel and the world moving on without it. None of us knew it then, but that invisible fraction of a second would become the most expensive lesson of the war. They told us later that our problem wasn't courage or discipline, it was arithmetic. The kind of cold, merciless arithmetic that doesn't care how tightly your stomach knots when a plane dives at you. We'd been losing to decimals. The explanation came during a briefing a few weeks after that mission. The engineering officer, pale, nervous, his voice shaking through the static of the loudspeaker, drew a simple line on a chalkboard. "Gentlemen," he said, "this is you." Then he drew another, crossing it sharply. "And this is the enemy." He tapped his pointer against the intersection. "By the time your bullet gets here," he said, "the enemy isn't here anymore." At first, I thought it was some kind of joke. How could a third of a second make the difference between life and death? But when he showed the numbers, the room went silent. A 50 caliber bullet leaves the barrel at roughly 2,900 feet per second. Sounds instant, right? But at 300 yards, about 900 feet, that bullet needs just over 3/10 of a second to reach its target. 3/10 of a second. I can still hear him tapping the board as he said it. In that time, a Japanese Zero flying at 300 miles per hour moves another 136 feet. That's 11 car lengths, an entire street of air between what you see and where your bullet arrives. Suddenly it made sense, the Firefly tracers chasing ghosts, the planes that slipped through our fire untouched. Every single man in that room had been shooting at where the enemy had been, not where he would be. The officer turned back to the diagram and circled the empty space in front of the crossing line. "You have to shoot here," he said. "Aim where there's nothing." A low murmur swept through the room. One of the tail gunners muttered, "You mean miss on purpose?" The officer didn't answer. He didn't need to. We all knew how it felt to line up a target perfectly, the calm before the burst, the moment when instinct whispers now. And now they were telling us that instinct itself was the enemy. The new term was deflection error, a neat, clinical phrase that didn't begin to describe the chaos it caused. To correct it, we'd have to lead the target not by inches, but by yards, 15 to 20 feet ahead of the nose, sometimes more. At 300 yards and 90 degrees, that meant aiming at empty sky, trusting the physics instead of your eyes. It was madness. Our instructors had tried teaching deflection shooting during training, but it never stuck. On the ground, everything seemed clear diagrams, formulas, neat little arrows on blackboards. But in the air, nothing held still. The Zero wasn't some fixed target. It twisted and climbed and rolled, the sunlight flickering off its wings, the sound of your own breathing drowning out every calculation. I tried once, in combat. I aimed ahead of a fighter slicing across from right to left, maybe 400 yards out. I fired a burst, saw my tracers streak through nothing, and thought I'd overled. So I corrected closer to the plane this time, still missed. Then I aimed right at it, squeezed the trigger, and watched my rounds chase harmlessly behind. That night I couldn't sleep. My hands kept replaying the motion, the way they'd tightened on the grips, the smell of hot metal when the barrel smoked. It wasn't just failure, it was betrayal. My eyes had lied to me, my instincts had lied to me, and the cost was men who didn't come back. The psychologists who later studied us called it target fixation. We called it being human. You point at the threat because every fiber of your being screams, that's where the danger is. Trying to fight that instinct felt like drowning with your eyes open. But the Army didn't have the luxury of despair. By early 1943, the Air Force's analysis was grim. Hit rates against crossing targets, 4%. At that rate, no amount of courage could compensate. They could replace planes, but not time. And time, we learned, was the one thing every bullet needed. As I stood outside the mess hall that evening, the Pacific sky fading into violet, I tried to imagine what 15 feet of empty air looked like through a gunsight. How do you convince yourself to aim at nothing when everything in you screams to aim at the thing trying to kill you? The answer, I'd discover, wasn't courage. It was obedience to math, to training, to something colder than instinct but far more reliable. But in 1943, we didn't have that training yet. We had noise, fear, and statistics that told us we were losing. The sky was still lying, and we were still listening. It turned out that someone had already solved our problem almost 20 years before we even knew it existed. His name was Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle, an artillery officer who believed the future of warfare wouldn't be decided by bravery or even technology, but by whether men could outthink their own instincts. No one listened to him. By the time we were dying in the skies over Europe and the Pacific, his warnings were collecting dust in a forgotten filing cabinet. The story of how that paper resurfaced felt almost like a ghost story. Captain Robert Williams, assigned to the 8th Air Force's Gunnery Analysis Section, had been digging through old research archives at Wright Field. It was 1943, and the losses were becoming unbearable. Bomber crews vanishing over Schweinfurt and Regensburg, fathers and sons and boys like me who never made it home. Williams wasn't a gunner. He was a quiet, analytical man, the kind who trusted numbers more than intuition. One night, surrounded by yellowed blueprints and forgotten diagrams, he found a folder labeled The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery J. Puckle, 1924. He read it in one sitting. When he emerged from the archive, his face was pale, his hands shaking. The paper didn't just describe our problem, it predicted it, line for line, as if Puckle had seen the war coming decades in advance. In his report, Puckle explained that once aircraft speeds passed 150 miles per hour, human intuition would no longer be capable of leading targets accurately. He'd laid out the math in painstaking tables, showing that at 250 miles per hour, a gunner would need to aim 4 to 5 aircraft lengths ahead of his target distances that made the target look like a speck floating in an empty patch of sky. He warned that without mechanical assistance, aerial gunnery would soon become impossible. The conclusions were devastating. Future speeds, he wrote, will outpace human instinct. I imagine him in some quiet office in the mid-1920 seconds, the ink drying under a single lamp, his handwriting neat, deliberate. Maybe he'd heard the faint hum of a propeller outside and understood, even then, that aviation would change faster than the men inside it could adapt. He sent the paper up the chain of command. The Army filed it, stamped it, and forgot about it. Williams' discovery spread quickly through the gunnery divisions. Commanders read the report with a sick recognition. Puckle hadn't just been right, he'd been right too soon. The Air Corps had entered World War II, still training marksmen like it was 1918. Breath control, steady hands, target practice at predictable angles. They were teaching men to shoot at deer, not lightning. When I first heard about the paper during a debriefing in mid-43, I felt both fury and awe. Someone had known all along that the laws of motion were going to betray us, and the warning had vanished under layers of bureaucracy. It wasn't negligence, it was something quieter, crueler, the military's eternal belief that instinct and courage would always fill the gaps that science left behind. The next week, our commanding officer held a meeting in a stifling tent, the heat making sweat drip down our necks as he summarized what Puckle had written. He was right, he said, tapping the chalkboard. The numbers don't lie. We're missing because we're human. We all sat in silence. There was nothing to argue with. Every man in that tent had lost a friend, a crew, maybe even faith in his own hands. I thought about Puckle sitting in his quiet study, pencil scratching over graph paper, while the world moved toward a speed that would make him a prophet. For me, something shifted that day. I realized we weren't just fighting an enemy, we were fighting our own nature. We were creatures of reaction, wired to chase what we see. But bullets needed prediction, not reaction. They needed belief. Belief that the invisible space ahead of an enemy plane could be more real than the metal flying right before your eyes. It was a terrible kind of faith, but faith all the same. Later, when I looked out from the gunner's window at the streaks of cloud cutting the Pacific sky, I imagined Puckle somewhere above us, whispering through time, "You're not wrong, boys. You're just late." The answer, when it finally appeared, didn't come from mathematicians or generals. It came from a clay pigeon shooter who happened to command a squadron of Spitfires. His name was Squadron Leader Horace Darley, and in the summer of 1940, while London burned and the RAF fought to stay alive, he decided to break every rule his instructors had ever taught him. Darley had spent years before the war standing on muddy fields, shotgun in hand, watching orange discs arc across the sky. He knew something every marksman forgot when they climbed into a cockpit. You don't think about lead. You feel it. You move with it. When the target flies, your hands don't calculate angles, they trust the rhythm of motion. The clay shooter doesn't aim. He becomes a fraction of a second ahead of the clay. When his pilots began missing German fighters in droves, Darley recognized the same flaw we Americans would face 2 years later. The human brain was too slow. Pilots were trying to think their way to accuracy in a fight that demanded something closer to instinct. So, during a lull in the Battle of Britain, he grounded his entire squadron, an act that nearly cost him his command and turned the airfield at Middle Wallop into a shooting gallery. They towed target banners across the sky with hurricanes, while Spitfire pilots made repeated firing passes. Darley told them something that sounded insane. Don't aim. Fire while you're still moving. At first, it was chaos. The pilots missed by entire city blocks of air. Their tracers stitched random lines across the clouds, miles from the banner. They cursed, laughed bitterly, and accused their leader of losing his mind. But Darley wouldn't let them stop. 40 passes per man, 3 days in a row. No lectures, no equations, just muscle memory, slowly carving new pathways through panic. By the third day, something changed. The pilots began to feel it, the strange, counterintuitive rhythm of leading ahead. When they stopped aiming and started flowing, bullets began to connect. 6% hit rate became 12, 12 became 15. Twice as many enemy planes shot down meant twice as many comrades coming home. Darley's experiment reached Fighter Command Headquarters, and his report was blunt. The mind is too slow. The body must learn the sky. He wrote that the best shooters weren't the calmest thinkers, but the ones who surrendered control to motion the way a baseball player catches a fly ball without ever solving the math. Some in command dismissed it as superstition. They couldn't accept that precision might come from surrender rather than control. But others listened. The RAF quietly began integrating his method into training. Across Britain, new recruits were told not to trust their eyes, but their movement, the gentle, terrifying art of firing before your target arrives. I remember hearing about Darley's idea months later, while stationed in the Pacific. It spread like rumor, carried by pilots and engineers who'd seen the footage. Men called it ghost shooting. The idea that your bullets could meet the future instead of the present. For the first time, deflection wasn't a calculation, it was a feeling, something primal that existed just beyond logic, like the way a bird turns before the wind shifts. Darley never got a medal for what he discovered. But every zero that went down because a man trusted his instincts against his instincts was his legacy. The strange part is, he wasn't teaching us to shoot. He was teaching us to let go. And that lesson would soon make its way across the ocean to a laboratory in Massachusetts, where a man named Charles Draper was about to give our gunners a new kind of instinct, mechanical. By 1943, the war had turned into a contest between speed and comprehension. The human mind had reached its limit. The next breakthrough came not from a battlefield, but from a quiet laboratory in Cambridge, Massachusetts, a place with the deliberately misleading name, the Radiation Laboratory. It sounded like they were chasing atomic secrets, but the real weapon they were building was understanding. Dr. Charles Stark Draper was the kind of man who could make a machine think in real time. He had spent years studying gyroscopes, instruments that could feel the world's movement even when human senses failed. To him, the problem of missed shots wasn't about courage or even eyesight. It was about prediction. He used to tell his students, "A man can aim, but a machine can foresee. In the summer heat of 1943, his team began assembling something that looked more like an artifact from the future than a gunsight. A gleaming contraption of glass, copper, and gears. It was called the Mark 14 Computing Gunsight. It weighed nearly 30 pounds and drew power straight from the aircraft's generator. Inside its polished casing, tiny gyroscopes spun, feeding motion through intricate cams and gears, analog computers, solving deflection in the time it took a man to blink. Here's how it worked. The gunner would dial in the enemy's wingspan, matching it to the glowing marks in his sight. Then, by tracking the target smoothly for 2 seconds, the gyroscope measured its angular velocity, how fast it cut across the field of view. The sight did the rest, calculating how far ahead the bullets needed to go. Instead of aiming at the target, the gunner now followed a floating light, a ghostly reticle suspended in the air ahead of the enemy plane. That light wasn't where the target was. It was where the target would be. When I first heard about it, I thought it was fantasy, a machine that could read the future. But when test results came back from the Naval Air Station in Norfolk that August, disbelief turned into awe. Gunners who had never hit more than 5% of their shots were now landing 18% on their very first day with the Mark 14. Within a week, they were exceeding 25%. That was a 5-fold leap in effectiveness, 5 times more enemy aircraft destroyed, 5 times more crews surviving the return home. The test reports spread through every squadron like rumor. We imagined this mythical sight glowing in the dark, a compass that pointed not north, but forward through time. Some said it was magic. Others said it was proof that machines had finally learned to think faster than men. But war doesn't wait for production lines. Manufacturing enough Mark 14 seconds to outfit every bomber would take months the Allies didn't have. New aircraft got them first. The rest of us kept flying with primitive iron sights and hope. I remember sitting in the waist position of my B-17, tracing my thumb along the cold metal rim of my gunsight and whispering to it, "You're blind, and so am I." Still, something about Draper's invention lit a spark, even for those who didn't have it. If a machine could predict the future, maybe a man could learn to do the same, not with formulas, but with faith in motion. The Mark 14 wasn't just a tool. It was a reminder that the laws of physics were not our enemy. They were simply waiting for us to catch up. That realization began to spread, carried not by scientists but by the men who flew and fought. And one of them, a soft-spoken staff sergeant in the Pacific, would take that idea and turn it into something the average gunner could use without wires, gyros, or electricity. All he needed was instinct, a notebook, and the courage to aim at nothing. His name was Bill Fleming. By 1944, the Pacific sky had become both classroom and graveyard. Every island, every mission, taught the same brutal lesson. The men who adapted survived. And no one adapted faster than Staff Sergeant Bill Fleming, a quiet gunner with oil-stained hands and the calm patience of someone who had run out of illusions. Fleming wasn't an officer. He didn't have the scientific vocabulary of Draper's engineers or the swagger of fighter pilots. He was just a waist gunner aboard one of the Navy's carriers, the USS Lexington, who had flown too many missions to believe in luck. 31 sorties, 4 plane losses, and more friends buried at sea than he could count. He kept a small black notebook tucked inside his flight jacket, a habit everyone teased him about. While others smoked or played cards after missions, Fleming sat under the wing of his plane and sketched. Not art, not poetry diagrams, little silhouettes of enemy planes, usually the Japanese Zero, with lines arcing out ahead of their noses. 2 plane lengths, 3 plane lengths. Next to each, short notes scrawled in pencil. Hit 3 ahead at 300 yards. Missed, led, too far. It was his own field experiment, done one tracer at a time. One day in March 1944, during a debriefing aboard the Lexington, Fleming handed that notebook to Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch, O'Hare Medal of Honor recipient, national hero, and tactician feared by the Japanese. O'Hare flipped through the pages slowly, eyes narrowing. What he held wasn't just idle doodling, it was empirical data, the first real, combat-proven map of how far to lead a moving aircraft. "Sergeant," O'Hare said, "you've just rewritten our gunnery manual." Within a week, Fleming was ordered to conduct training sessions for the entire air group. His method was simple, almost laughably so. He called it spot shooting. On the flight deck, he'd have one crewman walk with a model plane mounted on a long pole, weaving it across the deck like a moving target. Gunners stood in position, their weapons unloaded, aiming and pretending to fire. Fleming barked instructions through the salty wind: crossing fast, 2 lengths ahead; medium speed, 3; if it's diving, 4. He turned the abstract horror of deflection into something human, something you could see. You didn't need to calculate bullet speed or time of flight, you just counted plane lengths in your mind and trusted that space. The Lexington's gunnery officer didn't believe it at first. He authorized the training only as an experiment, pulling ammunition and combat reports from the past 2 months to measure results. By the end of April, the numbers silenced every skeptic. Before Fleming's training, the carrier group's gunners averaged just over 4 hits per 100 rounds against crossing targets. After 6 weeks of spot shooting practice, they were averaging 9, more than double. That improvement rippled through the Pacific like a rumor of salvation. Crews on the Enterprise, Bunker Hill, and Essex adopted the same drills, modifying them slightly for their planes and angles. Each carrier added its own touch-colored banners to simulate enemy wings, pacing guides drawn on deck planks. But the core remained: count the space, not the fear. For the first time, deflection was no longer math. It was memory. I remember watching one of those sessions months later. The ocean wind whipped at their uniforms as the model plane swung across the horizon, sunlight glinting off its painted wings. A dozen young gunners followed it with invisible fire, each of them whispering the count under their breath: 1, 2, 3 lengths ahead. The air hummed with discipline and something else: belief. Fleming didn't have Draper's machines or Darley's squadrons. He had nothing but experience, a pencil, and the nerve to write what he saw instead of what the manuals said. But his sketches saved more men than any theory. They say innovation is born of desperation. I think it's born of exhaustion, the kind that comes after too many funerals, when the only way to keep fighting is to make sense of the senseless. When the official Navy reports later listed Fleming's contribution, they called it a procedural improvement. But to those of us who flew, it was something simpler. He taught us that sometimes aiming at empty air was the most hopeful act in the world. Even after Fleming's method spread through the fleet, the hardest part of the war wasn't the sky, it was the mind. We could memorize every rule, count every plane length, whisper every ratio between speed and distance, and it still didn't matter when fear took over, because fear rewrites physics. By late 1944, the psychologists assigned to the Army Air Forces began to notice a strange, terrible pattern in gun camera footage. They called it threat fixation collapse. It happened in seconds, the moment when a fighter screamed toward a bomber formation and the gunner's world shrank to a single flashing image of death. At first, the tracers curved perfectly ahead of the target. Then, as the enemy drew closer and the adrenaline hit, those same tracers walked backward until they were aimed dead at the thing we feared most. It was instinct, dragging the gun back toward danger. Captain Harold Klein, one of those psychologists, described it better than any soldier could. Under fire, he wrote, the conscious mind evaporates. The primitive brain takes command, and the hands betray the training. Watching the footage, he saw the same mistake repeated by men on every front moments before their aircraft vanished in flames. I knew exactly what he meant. You could recite the manual all you wanted, but when you saw the fire from an enemy's guns, when the distance closed in half a heartbeat, all your courage turned liquid. You wanted to hit the threat, not the empty air in front of it. and that was enough to get you killed. The Army understood by then that the only way to fight instinct was repetition so relentless that it replaced fear with reflex. Training schools doubled their length. The old 4-week program became 8, then 10. Instead of firing 1,000 rounds, we fired 5,000. Half of them were against moving targets, towed banners, motorized sleds, even fast boats dragging mock aircraft across the water at 60 miles per hour. In Florida, at the Naval Air Gunner School in Jacksonville, they built an entire system for it. Turrets were mounted on spinning platforms so that gunners could swivel, elevate, and track as if they were in combat. The roar of the engines, mixed with the sea wind, boats raced by with targets whipping behind them, and every man had to fire 50 to 70 passes a day. No instructors shouted corrections. We learned through the rhythm of cause and effect. See, fire, check the pattern, adjust, try again. By the end of the second week, your body began to understand what your mind still resisted. The lead became a feeling in your arms, not a thought in your head. The moment you saw the enemy's motion, your hands were already ahead of it. That was when training stopped being instruction and started being survival. I remember one night sitting beside another gunner, a kid from Kansas named Rourke. He had just completed his 5,000th round of practice and stared out toward the dark ocean, hands trembling from recoil fatigue. "You know what's crazy?" he said. "I don't even think anymore. I just move." That was the goal. Mushin, the instructors called it no mind, a state where knowledge lived deeper than thought. By late '44, the difference showed. Veteran crews came back from missions shaken but alive, their gun camera footage revealing calm, steady leads, even when their planes were tearing apart around them. One clip showed a gunner keeping perfect deflection on an FW-190 diving straight through flak his rounds, cutting into the fighter's path before it even appeared in the frame. Seconds later, the German plane exploded into fragments. I watched that footage in silence. The man behind the gun had probably been terrified, convinced he'd die. But his hands had obeyed the training, not the fear. That was the new discipline, not courage, not heroism, but obedience to what your muscles had learned when your brain was screaming the opposite. The brass called it progress. I called it surrender, not to the enemy, but to physics. We stopped fighting our instincts and started letting the laws of motion carry us through. And maybe that was the real victory. Because every time I pulled the trigger after that, I wasn't aiming at the plane I saw. I was aiming at a ghost and trusting that my body would find it before my fear did. May 1945. The radios were full of church bells and static, the sound of victory mixed with exhaustion. Men walked home in silence through streets filled with ticker tape and ghosts. The war was over, but the huts, the strange curved shelters born in panic and welded in haste, refused to end with it. Across 6 continents, they stood like fossils of urgency, 170,000 Quonset huts gleaming in the morning light, each one a small echo of the war that had built it. Some still smelled of salt and sweat, some were dented from shrapnel, some were half buried in coral sand, and the military, suddenly faced with peace, had no idea what to do with them. At first, they talked about demolition, scrap the metal, melt it into cars, rebuild the world. But then came the numbers: 2 million returning soldiers. One country without enough roofs to hold them. Lumber was scarce, contractors scarcer still. Families slept in cars, in barns, in warehouses converted into dormitories. It was Raybould himself who said what everyone was thinking: why destroy what's already shelter? The War Assets Administration began selling surplus huts at liquidation prices, $1,000 for a full kit, sometimes less if you hauled it yourself. Veterans lined up outside government depots like it was Christmas. They called it the cheapest house in America. In Los Angeles, a sprawling field of huts became Roger Young Village, 750 families living under arches, that once faced the Pacific's typhoons. Children rode bicycles down the curved corridors between units, their laughter bouncing off steel walls that had once echoed with shellfire. In New Jersey and Oregon, entire neighborhoods rose out of surplus crates, the air filled with the sound of hammers and the smell of hope. Some people painted their huts pastel pinks and yellows, softening the war from memory. Others added porches and wooden facades, hiding the military bones beneath floral curtains and potted plants. Inside, the acoustics were odd voices curved back at you, but for the first time, the echo didn't sound like fear. By 1946, you could find Quonsets in every corner of the country. Near universities, they sprouted into makeshift towns called Vetvilles, filled with students studying under roofs that had survived bomb blasts. Professors lectured in what used to be supply huts. Young mothers hung laundry between arches that once sheltered rifles. School boards bought them too. The baby boom had begun, and classrooms were running out of walls. A single hut could hold 30 children, a teacher, and a blackboard. The paint flaked, the floors creaked, but the lessons stuck. In those round rooms, the generation that would walk on the moon learned to count. Even churches borrowed the design. In Levittown, Pennsylvania, a congregation raised their first Quonset chapel in a single weekend. They called it the Tin Tabernacle. The roof sang during rainstorms, but the pastor said the sound reminded him of wartime hymns, steady, metallic, unbreakable. For 20 years, the huts refused to fade. They stored grain in Kansas, housed artists in New York, and became workshops, garages, grocery stores, and dance halls. They were so common that no one thought of them as remarkable anymore, just part of the American landscape, curved like a horizon line. Yet they were never beautiful, not in the way architecture students understood beauty. They were plain, repetitive, utilitarian. And maybe that's why they lasted. Because beauty wasn't what people needed. They needed shelter that didn't lie, that didn't collapse, that kept its promise even after the war's noise had gone quiet. I used to drive past one near Providence, a small one, rust streaking down its sides, weeds growing at its base. Someone had turned it into a mechanic's shop. The paint on the sign above the door was faded, but the words were still legible, open since 1946. That's when I understood what we had built, not a temporary solution, not wartime ingenuity, but something eternal in its simplicity, an arch that could carry weight far beyond what we'd imagined. And though we didn't know it then, that same shape would one day rise again in disaster zones, in refugee camps, even on the red dust of Mars. The same geometry, the same principle. Strength through curve, survival through simplicity. The war had ended, but the huts had not. They had become something more, proof that when humanity is cornered, its best ideas don't fade with the fighting. They adapt, evolve, and shelter the generations that come after. I sometimes think about that winter night in Washington, when Raybould whispered that we were fighting the weather. I wish he could have seen how far that fight went, how many lives that curve would touch. Because in the end, the Quonset wasn't just steel and bolts. It was endurance, bent into shape. By the winter of 1944, the air war had changed. Not in the way newspapers described it, not in headlines about new bomb loads or faster planes, but in something quieter, something inside the men themselves. The human mind, once the weak link in the sky, had begun to bend toward the math. The difference showed up first in the footage. Analysts reviewing gun cameras from returning bombers noticed a strange new steadiness. The tracers no longer wandered or danced erratically across the frame. They appeared ahead of enemy aircraft, perfectly curved into the path of motion, a neat red thread leading straight into metal and fire. You could almost see the moment instinct stopped resisting and started obeying. We'd stopped aiming at things and started aiming for them, for where they'd be, not where they were. The sky was still chaos, but we had finally learned its rhythm. I flew my 30th mission around that time, The Pacific was a vast, blinding blue, and the air was hot enough to turn sweat into salt dust. Our formation moved like a school of fish, tight and silent. Somewhere below, Japanese fighters were climbing. I could see their glints in the sun before I could even make out the wings. When the first Zero crossed our field, I didn't think. My hands moved before my fear had time to form. 3 plane lengths ahead, steady breath, trigger press. The tracers curved forward, and the fighter flew right into them exactly, uncannily where I knew it would. It erupted in a blossom of orange flame. I didn't cheer, I didn't even breathe. I just watched the pieces tumble into the ocean and realized I'd stopped fighting the laws of motion. That was the day I understood what the instructors meant by no mind. You stop calculating, you stop hoping, you just exist inside the fraction of a second that physics allows you. Our hit rates kept climbing. By early 1945, trained crews were landing hits at rates that would have seemed impossible 2 years earlier, 20, even 30% in some squadrons. The difference between a veteran formation and a new one became visible in the air. Experienced gunners fired short, precise bursts that sliced through the enemy like they were tracing geometry. New crews panicked, wasted ammunition, and vanished into the clouds. The Germans caught on first. Their aces learned to recognize formations with steady fire patterns and avoided them, diving instead on the ones that sprayed wildly. In their reports, they called the seasoned units iron walls. But there was a strange irony buried in that progress. The better we got at shooting, the less human we felt. The motion became mechanical, detached, almost serene. You'd watch a fighter die and feel nothing. The same instinct that once trembled with fear was now steady, quiet, efficient, and that calmness scared me more than the enemy ever had. Still, the results spoke for themselves. Our formations survived longer, our losses dropped, and the idea that once seemed insane, aiming into empty air, had become law. Somewhere in that evolution, the war stopped being a battle between men and became a battle between thought and reaction. We had learned to see the invisible, to trust the unseen. Draper's gyroscopes had done it with gears. Fleming had done it with sketches. The rest of us did it with repetition until instinct itself changed shape. I sometimes wondered what Puckle would have thought if he'd lived to see it, if he would have smiled, knowing his math had become muscle memory for thousands of men who'd never heard his name. By the end, we weren't just soldiers anymore. We were proof that even instinct, the deepest, most primal part of us, could be rewritten. When the war finally ended and the engines fell silent, I thought the lessons we'd carved into the sky would vanish with the noise, but they didn't. They only changed shape. Because everything that came after every radar, every missile, every smart weapon that could think ahead was born from that same revelation that had taken us years of failure and blood to understand. Aim for where the future will be, not where the present stands. The Mark 14 sight we'd prayed for evolved into the Mark 18, and then into digital systems that could solve deflection equations thousands of times per second. In Korea, our jets carried versions of Draper's gyroscopes. In Vietnam, they turned into lead computing radars that guided cannon fire automatically. By the time the F-4 Phantom took to the skies, machines no longer guessed. They knew. The reticle that once floated ahead of a Zero now existed inside a screen, moving faster than thought itself. And yet, even as the technology perfected the math, the physics never changed. Missiles just learned to do what we once struggled to imagine, to think like a bullet that believes in tomorrow. The AMRAAM missile calculates lead angles hundreds of times a second, continuously adjusting its path toward a point that doesn't yet exist. The F-22's radar predicts enemy positions before the pilots even see them. Draper's vision, Puckle's warning, Fleming's intuition, all still living inside the code. Sometimes, when I see footage of those sleek, gray machines streaking through the sky, I think of the waist gunners who stood where I once stood, eyes wide, lungs burning through an oxygen mask, firing at the impossible. They'd never believed that their fear had built this precision. Even video games today teach kids what we learned the hard way. I've seen them young players laughing, shouting to one another, "Lead your shot." And they don't even realize they're practicing a principle written first in blood and panic over Europe and the Pacific. The instinct that killed us once has been trained out of the human race. Every time a computer locks onto a target, it's echoing those nights when we stared into empty air and squeezed the trigger anyway. Every time a modern pilot fires a weapon that curves into an enemy before he even appears, that's Draper's ghost and Fleming's whispering from the past. I think about Eddie Kowalski sometimes, that 19-year-old boy over the Solomon Islands, his hands trembling on the grips of his gun, wondering why his bullets vanished into nothing. If he could see the world now, guided missiles, predictive AI, autonomous targeting, maybe he'd understand that all of it began with his failure. That missing the mark was the first step toward teaching the world to hit what it couldn't yet see. That's the strange grace of it all. The men who died firing into empty sky didn't die in vain. They taught us how to trust what isn't there. Because in war, as in life, instinct will always tell you to aim at what's visible. But survival, real survival, belongs to those who believe in what's coming next.